Sarah Martinez wiped the sweat from her forehead as she walked across the dusty airfield at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. The scorching summer heat made her flight suit stick to her skin, but she had grown used to discomfort during her 3 years of military service. At 26, she was one of the youngest helicopter pilots in her unit, and certainly one of the few women attempting to qualify for Apache attack helicopter certification. The other pilots barely acknowledged her presence as she passed the hangar where they gathered each morning. Their conversations would quiet when she approached, then resume in hushed tones after she moved on. Sarah had heard the whispers countless times before. They questioned whether a woman could handle the physical and mental demands of flying the most advanced attack helicopter in the world. Some doubted her technical skills, while others wondered if she would crack under pressure during combat situations. Colonel James Harrison, the unit commander, had made his position clear from the beginning. He believed women belonged in support roles, not in combat aircraft. During briefings, he would often direct his questions and explanations exclusively to the male pilots, treating Sarah as if she were invisible. When she volunteered for challenging missions or training exercises, Harrison would assign her to routine transport duties instead. The Apache AH-64 stood like a mechanical predator on the tarmac, its sleek black body gleaming under the morning sun. This particular aircraft had seen action in 3 different conflicts and bore the scars of battle. Bullet holes had been patched and the paint showed wear from countless hours of flight time. To most people, it looked intimidating and dangerous. To Sarah, it represented everything she had worked toward since joining the military. Her journey to this moment had been filled with obstacles that would have discouraged most people. Growing up in a small Texas town, Sarah had been fascinated by aircraft since childhood. Her father worked as a mechanic at the local airport, and she spent countless hours watching planes take off and land. When she told her high school guidance counselor about her dream of becoming a military pilot, the woman had gently suggested she consider nursing or teaching instead. The military recruitment process had been her first taste of the skepticism she would face throughout her career. The recruiter had tried to steer her toward administrative positions, explaining that pilot training was extremely competitive and physically demanding. Sarah had insisted on pursuing her goal, scoring in the top 5% on all aptitude tests and excelling in every phase of basic training. Flight school had presented its own set of challenges. Male instructors often gave her harder tasks and shorter deadlines than her classmates. During night training exercises, some fellow students would play pranks designed to rattle her confidence. Equipment would mysteriously malfunction during her sessions, forcing her to adapt quickly or fail. Sarah responded by working twice as hard as everyone else, studying technical manuals until late at night, and practicing emergency procedures until they became second nature. Her first assignment to a transport helicopter unit had been disappointing but not surprising. Women were generally assigned to support roles rather than combat positions. Sarah flew medical evacuation missions and cargo transport, building hundreds of flight hours while watching male pilots with less experience get promoted to attack helicopter training. She submitted request after request for transfer to Apache training, only to have each one denied without explanation. The breakthrough had come unexpectedly during a joint training exercise with Special Operations Forces. Sarah had been flying a routine supply mission when radio chatter revealed that the primary Apache pilot assigned to provide air support had fallen ill with food poisoning. The mission was critical, involving the extraction of intelligence assets from behind enemy lines. Without Apache support, the ground team would be vulnerable to enemy fire. Sarah had immediately volunteered to fill the gap, despite having no official Apache certification. She had spent months studying the aircraft's technical specifications and weapon systems in her spare time, hoping for exactly this kind of opportunity. The mission commander had been reluctant to accept her offer, but with no other qualified pilots available and time running short, he had agreed to let her attempt the mission. The night flight had been a test of everything Sarah had learned about herself and her abilities. Flying an unfamiliar aircraft in hostile territory required split-second decisions and absolute precision. She had successfully provided covering fire for the ground team's extraction, destroying 2 enemy positions, and enabling the safe recovery of valuable intelligence. The mission report had praised her quick thinking and exceptional flying skills. Despite this success, Colonel Harrison had been furious about her unauthorized use of the Apache. He had threatened disciplinary action, and reminded Sarah that she was not qualified to fly attack helicopters. The Special Operations Commander had intervened on her behalf, pointing out that her actions had saved lives and completed a critical mission. This intervention had forced Harrison to allow Sarah to begin official Apache training, though he made it clear that he expected her to fail. Now, 6 months later, Sarah stood at the threshold of completing her certification. She had passed every written exam and practical test, often scoring higher than her male counterparts. Her flight instructors had grudgingly admitted that she possessed exceptional skills and remarkable composure under pressure. However, one final evaluation remained before she could be officially designated as an Apache pilot. The final test would involve a simulated combat mission designed to push pilots to their absolute limits. Previous candidates had faced mechanical failures, communication blackouts, and multiple target scenarios that required instant tactical decisions. Several experienced pilots had failed this evaluation, unable to handle the stress and complexity of the exercise. Sarah knew that her performance on this test would determine not only her own future but also the opportunities available to other women who wanted to follow in her footsteps. The weight of that responsibility felt heavier than any aircraft she had ever flown. As she approached the Apache for her final pre-flight inspection, she could feel the skeptical eyes of her colleagues watching from across the airfield. The morning briefing had revealed the scope of her final evaluation. She would be required to complete a solo mission involving multiple targets, electronic warfare scenarios, and simulated equipment failures. The exercise was designed to replicate the most challenging conditions she might face in actual combat. Sarah had spent the previous evening reviewing every possible contingency, but she knew that real success would depend on her ability to adapt to unexpected situations. Standing beside the Apache, Sarah ran her hands along its armored hull and checked each weapon system with methodical precision. This aircraft would either be her gateway to proving that gender had no bearing on combat effectiveness, or it would become a symbol of her failure in front of everyone who had doubted her abilities from the beginning. The pre-dawn darkness provided cover as Sarah completed her final equipment checks. The Apache's engines hummed with mechanical precision, every gauge and display showing optimal readings. She had arrived at the airfield 2 hours earlier than required, using the extra time to familiarize herself with this particular aircraft's unique characteristics. Each Apache had subtle differences in handling and responsiveness, details that could prove crucial during high-stress situations. Master Sergeant Rodriguez, her assigned crew chief, had been working on helicopters for 15 years and had seen dozens of pilots attempt their final evaluations. He watched Sarah's methodical preparation with growing respect. Most pilots, especially younger ones, showed visible nervousness before such an important test. Sarah displayed the calm focus of a seasoned combat veteran, despite her relatively limited experience with the Apache platform. The mission briefing had outlined a complex scenario involving multiple hostile targets scattered across a 50-mile radius of rugged terrain. Intelligence reports indicated that enemy forces had established several anti-aircraft positions that posed a threat to friendly ground operations. Sarah's task was to locate and neutralize these threats while avoiding detection and managing limited ammunition supplies. The exercise would test her tactical planning, weapons accuracy, and ability to adapt when situations changed unexpectedly. Colonel Harrison entered the briefing room just as Sarah finished reviewing the target coordinates. His expression made it clear that he still harbored doubts about her capabilities. During the mission overview, he had emphasized the importance of following established protocols and avoiding unnecessary risks. His tone suggested that he expected Sarah to make critical errors that would justify his previous opposition to women in combat roles. The supporting cast for the evaluation included radar operators, intelligence analysts, and safety observers who would monitor every aspect of her performance. Each radio transmission would be recorded, every weapon system activation logged, and all flight path deviations documented for later analysis. The comprehensive monitoring felt intimidating, but Sarah understood that the scrutiny was necessary to ensure that her eventual certification could not be questioned or challenged. Weather conditions added another layer of complexity to the mission. A storm front was moving through the area, bringing low clouds and gusty winds that would make target identification more difficult. The evaluation committee had considered postponing the exercise, but Sarah had requested to proceed as scheduled. She argued that combat missions rarely occurred under ideal conditions, and pilots needed to demonstrate their abilities regardless of environmental challenges. As Sarah strapped herself into the Apache's pilot seat, she felt the familiar sense of connection between herself and the machine. The helicopter's advanced targeting systems and weapons platforms represented the pinnacle of military aviation technology. Mastering these systems required not only technical knowledge, but also the intuitive understanding that came from countless hours of practice and study. The Apache's twin engines spooled up with increasing intensity, creating the distinctive whop-whop sound that had become synonymous with American military power. Sarah ran through her pre-flight checklist with mechanical precision, testing each system and verifying that all weapons were properly configured for the mission ahead. The aircraft's sophisticated computer systems displayed targeting information, navigation data, and communication frequencies in a format that allowed instant access to critical information. Radio chatter from the control tower indicated that her flight path had been cleared and that all monitoring stations were ready to begin the evaluation. Sarah acknowledged the clearance and slowly lifted the Apache off the ground, feeling the aircraft respond to her control inputs with smooth precision. The initial phase of the mission required her to navigate to the first target area while maintaining low altitude to avoid simulated radar detection. Flying the Apache at high speed just above the treetops demanded absolute concentration and perfect coordination between hand and eye movements. The terrain below consisted of dense forest broken by occasional clearings and rocky outcroppings that could conceal enemy positions. Sarah used the helicopter's advanced sensor systems to scan for threats while simultaneously monitoring her fuel consumption and ammunition status. The first target appeared on her display screens as she approached the designated coordinates. Intelligence reports had indicated the presence of a mobile anti-aircraft system that posed a significant threat to friendly aircraft. Sarah maneuvered the Apache into an attack position while staying below the enemy's radar coverage. The targeting system locked onto the threat, and she fired a precision missile that eliminated the target with a direct hit. Immediately after the successful engagement, Sarah received updated intelligence indicating that enemy forces were repositioning their remaining anti-aircraft systems. The new information forced her to modify her planned attack route and approach the remaining targets from unexpected directions. This type of real-time adaptation was exactly what the evaluation was designed to test, requiring pilots to demonstrate tactical flexibility under pressure. The second target area presented a more complex challenge. Multiple enemy positions were clustered around a strategic hilltop, with overlapping fields of fire that made a direct approach extremely dangerous. Sarah studied the terrain and enemy positions, developing an attack plan that would allow her to engage each threat while minimizing her exposure to return fire. The solution required precise timing and coordination between her movements and weapons deployments. Using the Apache's ability to hover behind terrain features, Sarah positioned herself for a surprise attack from an unexpected angle. She popped up from behind a ridgeline, acquired multiple targets simultaneously, and fired a coordinated salvo that eliminated 3 enemy positions within seconds. The attack was executed with textbook precision, demonstrating mastery of both tactical planning and weapon system operation. Weather conditions continued to deteriorate as Sarah moved toward the final target area. The approaching storm brought heavy rain and reduced visibility that made navigation more challenging. Wind gusts buffeted the Apache, requiring constant control adjustments to maintain stable flight. These conditions would have prompted most training exercises to be canceled, but Sarah pressed forward with determined focus. The third target location initially appeared empty when Sarah arrived at the designated coordinates. Her sensors detected no immediate threats, but intelligence reports insisted that enemy forces were present in the area. Sarah expanded her search pattern, using the Apache's advanced detection systems to scan for hidden or camouflaged positions. The patient, methodical search eventually revealed a cleverly concealed anti-aircraft installation that had escaped initial detection. This final engagement required Sarah to approach the target from an extremely difficult angle due to surrounding terrain features. The target was positioned in a narrow valley with steep sides that limited her maneuvering options. A successful attack would require her to fly through the valley at high speed, acquire the target within a narrow window of opportunity, and escape before enemy forces could respond. Sarah executed the challenging attack with flawless precision, destroying the final target and completing the primary mission objectives. However, as she climbed away from the target area, her radio crackled with an urgent transmission that would transform her evaluation exercise into something far more serious and dangerous than anyone had anticipated. The urgent radio transmission cut through the static of the worsening storm with crystal clarity that made Sarah's blood run cold. Emergency dispatch was reporting a real-world crisis developing just 30 miles from her current position. A commercial airliner carrying 147 passengers had declared an emergency and was attempting a forced landing at a small regional airport. The situation had escalated beyond a simple mechanical failure when ground controllers discovered that armed hijackers had taken control of the aircraft. Sarah's initial instinct was to return to base immediately and allow properly designated response teams to handle the emerging crisis. Her training exercise was complete, and she had no official authorization to involve herself in an active hostage situation. However, the dispatcher's next transmission revealed information that changed everything about her decision-making process. The hijacked aircraft was rapidly running out of fuel due to extended flight time caused by the hijackers' demands for course changes. Weather conditions at the regional airport were deteriorating rapidly, with visibility dropping below minimum safe landing standards. Most critically, the airport's emergency response capabilities were severely limited, and no military assets were positioned close enough to provide immediate assistance. Air traffic control was coordinating with FBI negotiators who were attempting to establish communication with the hijackers through the aircraft's radio systems. Initial contact had revealed that the 3 armed men aboard the plane were demanding the release of several imprisoned associates in safe passage to a foreign country. They had threatened to harm passengers if their demands were not met within a specific time frame that was rapidly approaching. Sarah found herself in an unprecedented situation that her training had never specifically addressed. She was flying the most advanced attack helicopter in the world, positioned closer to the crisis than any other military asset, but she had no clear authority to intervene. The weight of 147 innocent lives hung in the balance while she wrestled with the decision of whether to act beyond her official capacity. The regional airport where the hijacked plane was attempting to land sat in a valley surrounded by hills that would make any rescue operation extremely challenging. Local law enforcement had cordoned off the area, but they lacked the specialized equipment and training necessary to deal with an airborne hostage situation. The nearest FBI hostage rescue team was still 2 hours away, far too long given the aircraft's fuel situation and the hijackers' increasingly desperate demands. Colonel Harrison's voice crackled over Sarah's radio, ordering her to return to base immediately and leave the crisis to appropriate authorities. His transmission was partially garbled by atmospheric interference from the storm, but his intent was unmistakably clear. Sarah was to disengage from the situation and avoid any unauthorized involvement that could complicate official response efforts. Sarah acknowledged the colonel's transmission, but found herself unable to simply fly away while innocent people faced mortal danger. She had spent years training for situations that required split-second decisions under extreme pressure. Every fiber of her being rebelled against the idea of abandoning people in desperate need when she possessed the capability to help them. The commercial aircraft appeared on Sarah's radar screen as it approached the regional airport for its emergency landing attempt. The plane was flying erratically, suggesting that either the pilots were struggling with mechanical problems or the hijackers were interfering with normal flight operations. Radio transmissions from the aircraft revealed growing panic in the cockpit as fuel levels dropped to critical minimums. Air traffic controllers were providing emergency landing guidance while simultaneously coordinating with law enforcement agencies on the ground. The airport's single runway had been cleared of all other traffic, and emergency vehicles were positioning themselves along the flight path. However, everyone involved in the response effort understood that a successful landing would only mark the beginning of a potentially deadly standoff. Sarah made the decision that would define the rest of her military career and possibly her life. Instead of returning to base as ordered, she altered her course toward the regional airport while requesting permission to provide surveillance and communication support to the crisis response effort. She knew that her unauthorized involvement could result in court-martial proceedings, but she could not ignore the opportunity to save innocent lives. The Apache's advanced sensor systems allowed Sarah to monitor the hijacked aircraft's approach, while maintaining a safe distance that would not alarm the hijackers or interfere with landing operations. She positioned herself where she could observe the entire airport and surrounding area, providing real-time intelligence to ground-based response teams about the developing situation. The commercial airliner touched down hard on the runway, its landing gear straining under the impact of a hurried approach in difficult weather conditions. The aircraft rolled to a stop near the terminal building, where it sat like a ticking time bomb filled with frightened passengers and desperate criminals. Emergency vehicles surrounded the plane at a respectful distance while negotiators attempted to establish productive communication with the hijackers. Sarah observed through her targeting systems as armed figures moved inside the aircraft's cabin, their silhouettes visible through the passenger windows. The hijackers appeared to be growing increasingly agitated as they realized that their demands were not being met according to their original timeline. Radio intercepts revealed heated arguments between the hijackers and attempts by the flight crew to calm the situation. Ground-based law enforcement commanders were requesting detailed intelligence about the aircraft's position, the number of visible hostiles, and potential approach routes for rescue teams. Sarah found herself uniquely positioned to provide this critical information due to the Apache's sophisticated surveillance capabilities and her elevated vantage point above the airport. The situation deteriorated rapidly when one of the hijackers apparently became convinced that law enforcement was planning an immediate assault on the aircraft. Radio transmissions from inside the plane revealed shouting and what sounded like physical altercations between hijackers and passengers. The lead negotiator's voice grew increasingly urgent as he tried to de-escalate the growing violence. Sarah watched in horror as a passenger door opened and one of the hijackers appeared with what appeared to be an explosive device strapped to his chest. The man was clearly visible in her targeting system, standing in the aircraft's doorway while making threatening gestures toward the surrounding emergency vehicles. His actions suggested that the situation was rapidly spiraling beyond the control of anyone on the ground. The FBI negotiators' radio transmissions revealed that the hijackers had issued an ultimatum giving authorities exactly 10 minutes to meet their demands or face the consequences. The timeline was impossibly short, and everyone involved understood that the hijackers were prepared to follow through on their threats against innocent passengers. Sarah realized that conventional rescue approaches would be impossible given the hijackers' obvious willingness to use violence and explosives. The confined space of the aircraft cabin made any ground-based assault extremely risky for passengers, while the hijackers' elevated position and explosive devices created nearly insurmountable tactical challenges for law enforcement. As the 10-minute deadline approached with no resolution in sight, Sarah faced the most important decision of her life. She possessed the capability to neutralize the threat, but doing so would require her to act completely outside her authority and potentially violate numerous military regulations and international laws governing the use of military force in domestic situations. With less than 3 minutes remaining before the hijackers' deadline expired, Sarah made a decision that would haunt and define her for the rest of her life. She contacted the senior FBI agent coordinating the ground response and offered to attempt a precision intervention using the Apache's weapons systems. The proposal was unprecedented and fraught with legal and tactical complications that could result in catastrophic consequences. The FBI agent initially rejected Sarah's offer, explaining that military intervention in domestic law enforcement situations required authorization from the highest levels of government. Such approvals typically took hours or days to obtain through proper channels, time that simply did not exist given the immediate threat to passenger lives. The agent emphasized that any unauthorized military action could create international incidents and domestic legal crises. Sarah pressed her case by pointing out that the hijackers' possession of explosive devices made conventional rescue attempts virtually impossible. Law enforcement snipers could not guarantee clean shots due to the aircraft's structure and the hijackers' positioning, while any assault team attempting to board the plane would face certain casualties from explosive devices. The Apache represented the only available option for neutralizing the threat before innocent people died. The radio frequencies buzzed with frantic communications between local law enforcement, FBI headquarters, and military command structures as officials tried to determine who had authority to authorize or prohibit Sarah's proposed intervention. Meanwhile, the hijacker's deadline continued counting down with mathematical precision, each passing second bringing 147 innocent passengers closer to potential death. Colonel Harrison's voice exploded over Sarah's radio with orders to disengage immediately and return to base without any further involvement in the crisis. His transmission was followed by threats of court-martial proceedings and immediate arrest if she continued her unauthorized actions. However, atmospheric interference from the worsening storm continued to disrupt communications, providing Sarah with plausible justification for not receiving clear orders. The lead hijacker appeared in the aircraft doorway again, this time holding a frightened child who could not have been more than 8 years old. The man's explosive vest was clearly visible, and his body language suggested that he was prepared to detonate the device if his demands were not met within the remaining time limit. His actions transformed the crisis from a negotiable hostage situation into an immediate threat to innocent lives. Sarah positioned the Apache for optimal targeting while maintaining enough distance to avoid detection by the hijackers. The helicopter's advanced weapon systems could deliver precision strikes with minimal collateral damage, but the shot would require extraordinary accuracy given the proximity of innocent passengers. Any miscalculation could result in the deaths of the very people she was trying to save. The aircraft structure and the hijackers' position created an extremely narrow window of opportunity for a successful intervention. Sarah would need to fire through the aircraft's doorway at an angle that would neutralize the threat without damaging critical aircraft systems or harming passengers in adjacent seats. The shot would require split-second timing and absolute precision under conditions that challenged even the most experienced combat pilots. Ground-based observers reported movement inside the aircraft cabin that suggested the hijackers were preparing to carry out their threatened actions against passengers. Radio intercepts revealed increasingly desperate conversations between the hijackers as they realized that their demands would not be met within their specified time frame. The situation had deteriorated beyond any possibility of peaceful resolution. The senior FBI agent made a decision that would later generate congressional investigations and policy reviews at the highest levels of government. Without explicit authorization from his superiors, he gave Sarah unofficial permission to attempt her proposed intervention. His decision was based on the assessment that conventional rescue options had been exhausted and that immediate action was necessary to prevent mass casualties. Sarah acknowledged the FBI agent's transmission and began her final approach toward the hijacked aircraft. The Apache's targeting systems locked onto the primary threat, while computer algorithms calculated the precise firing solution needed to neutralize the hijacker without causing collateral damage. Every system indicator showed green as Sarah prepared to take a shot that would either save 147 lives or create a disaster of unimaginable proportions. The hijacker in the doorway raised his arm in a gesture that suggested he was about to activate his explosive device. Intelligence analysts monitoring the situation reported that similar gestures had preceded terrorist attacks in other parts of the world, indicating that the threat was immediate and genuine. The moment for action had arrived, with no time remaining for further deliberation or authorization. Sarah squeezed the trigger with the steady precision that had made her one of the top marksmen in her training class. The Apache's 30mm cannon fired a single round that struck the hijacker with surgical accuracy, neutralizing the threat without damaging the aircraft or harming nearby passengers. The explosive device fell harmlessly to the ground outside the aircraft, its detonation mechanism rendered inoperable by the precise strike. The remaining two hijackers inside the aircraft cabin immediately surrendered when they realized that their primary threat had been eliminated and that they were surrounded by overwhelming law enforcement response. Passengers began evacuating through emergency exits while FBI agents and local police secured the aircraft and arrested the surviving terrorists. The crisis that had threatened 147 innocent lives was resolved with no casualties among passengers or crew members. Emergency medical teams rushed to treat several passengers who had suffered minor injuries during the hijacking ordeal, but the overall outcome was beyond anyone's most optimistic predictions. A situation that could have resulted in massive loss of life had been resolved through the combination of Sarah's unauthorized initiative and extraordinary marksmanship skills developed through years of dedicated training. However, even as passengers celebrated their survival and law enforcement officials praised the successful resolution of the crisis, Sarah understood that her unauthorized actions would generate serious consequences. Military law and domestic policy regarding the use of armed forces in civilian situations had been violated in ways that could not be ignored or overlooked by her superiors. Colonel Harrison's radio transmissions became increasingly furious as he demanded Sarah's immediate return to base for arrest and processing. His messages made it clear that she would face the most serious charges possible under military law, including insubordination, unauthorized use of military weapons, and violation of domestic security protocols. The successful outcome of her intervention would not protect her from the legal consequences of her actions. The media response began within minutes of the crisis resolution, as news helicopters arrived at the scene and reporters attempted to piece together the sequence of events that had led to such an unusual rescue operation. Initial reports focused on the successful resolution of the hijacking, but questions about military involvement and authorization would soon dominate the coverage. Sarah flew the Apache back toward Fort Campbell with the knowledge that her military career was likely over, regardless of the lives she had saved or the skill she had demonstrated. The unauthorized nature of her intervention had violated fundamental principles of military command structure and civilian control over armed forces that could not be overlooked, even in light of the successful outcome. As she approached the base, Sarah could see military police vehicles positioned along the flight line, ready to arrest her as soon as the Apache touched down. The woman who had been underestimated throughout her military career was about to face the ultimate test of whether her actions would be judged by their results or by their adherence to military protocol and legal authority. The Apache touched down on the Fort Campbell flight line with Sarah knowing that each rotation of the rotor blades might be among her last as a military pilot. Military police vehicles surrounded the helicopter before the engines had fully spooled down, their occupants wearing the grim expressions of soldiers carrying out unpleasant but necessary duties. The contrast between the successful rescue operation and her impending arrest created a surreal atmosphere that seemed to mock everything she had accomplished. Colonel Harrison strode across the tarmac with a fury that was visible from a considerable distance. His face was flushed with anger, and his movements carried the rigid precision of a career officer whose authority had been publicly challenged and undermined. Behind him walked the base legal officer, carrying a briefcase that undoubtedly contained the paperwork necessary to initiate court-martial proceedings against Sarah, as Sarah shut down the Apache systems and prepared to face the consequences of her actions. She reflected on the events that had brought her to this moment. The successful rescue of 147 innocent passengers provided some comfort, but she understood that good intentions and positive outcomes would not protect her from military justice. Her unauthorized use of military weapons in a domestic situation had violated fundamental principles that governed the relationship between civilian and military authority. The base commander, Brigadier General Patricia Williams, arrived at the flight line just as military police were preparing to place Sarah under arrest. General Williams was known throughout the military as a fair but demanding officer who had risen through the ranks during an era when women faced even greater obstacles than Sarah had encountered. Her presence at Sarah's arrest suggested that the incident had already attracted attention at the highest levels of military command. News media helicopters circled overhead like mechanical vultures, their cameras recording every detail of Sarah's arrest for broadcast to a national audience that was just beginning to learn about the extraordinary rescue operation. Initial news reports had focused on the successful resolution of the hijacking crisis, but the story was rapidly evolving to include questions about military authorization and the unprecedented nature of Sarah's intervention. The arrest procedure was conducted with professional courtesy but unmistakable finality. Sarah was informed of her rights under military law and advised that she would be held pending a formal investigation into her actions during the hijacking incident. The charges being considered included insubordination, unauthorized use of military weapons, violation of domestic security protocols, and conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline. Colonel Harrison's first interrogation session revealed the depth of his anger about Sarah's unauthorized actions. He emphasized that military discipline and chain of command were fundamental principles that could not be compromised regardless of circumstances or outcomes. According to Harrison, Sarah's decision to act without authorization had created dangerous precedents that could encourage other service members to ignore orders and take independent action in future situations. The legal implications of Sarah's intervention extended far beyond military justice into areas of constitutional law and domestic security policy. The use of military weapons by armed forces personnel in domestic law enforcement situations was governed by complex federal statutes that had been developed to prevent the militarization of civilian policing. Sarah's actions had potentially violated multiple federal laws that carried serious criminal penalties. Media attention intensified as details of the rescue operation became public knowledge through witness accounts and official statements from law enforcement agencies. The story had all the elements that attracted intense public interest: a female military pilot, a dramatic rescue operation, questions about authority and protocol, and 147 saved lives. News organizations began investigating Sarah's background and military record, transforming her from an unknown pilot into a national figure. Public opinion began forming along predictable lines that reflected broader social and political divisions about women in military roles. The proper use of military force and the balance between following orders and taking initiative. Supporters praised Sarah's courage and skill in saving innocent lives, while critics argued that military discipline and civilian control over armed forces were more important than individual heroics. The FBI investigation into the hijacking incident provided additional complications for Sarah's legal situation. Federal agents needed to interview her extensively about her observations during the crisis and her decision-making process leading up to the intervention. These interviews were conducted under formal legal protocols that could generate evidence for use in both military and civilian legal proceedings. Congressional interest in the incident developed rapidly as lawmakers sought to understand the policy implications of Sarah's unauthorized intervention. Several congressional committees announced plans to hold hearings about military involvement in domestic law enforcement situations and the adequacy of existing authorization procedures for emergency responses. Sarah's actions had inadvertently triggered a national debate about military roles and civilian authority. The commercial airline passengers who had been saved by Sarah's intervention began speaking publicly about their experience and their gratitude for her actions. Several passengers organized efforts to support Sarah during her legal proceedings, arguing that her violation of military protocol was justified by the lives she had saved. Their advocacy efforts generated additional media attention and public sympathy for Sarah's situation. Legal experts consulted by news organizations offered conflicting opinions about Sarah's likely fate under military justice. Some argued that the successful outcome of her intervention and the lives she had saved would result in lenient treatment, possibly including administrative discipline rather than court-martial proceedings. Others insisted that military law allowed no exceptions for unauthorized actions, regardless of their consequences or motivations. The international implications of the incident began attracting attention from foreign governments and military organizations. Several allied nations had experienced similar hostage situations, where military intervention might have saved lives, but was prohibited by domestic law and policy. Sarah's case was being studied as a potential precedent for modifying emergency response protocols in democratic societies. Sarah's family members found themselves thrust into an unwanted spotlight as media organizations sought to understand her background and motivations. Her parents, who had always supported her military ambitions despite social pressures and skepticism from others, faced intense questioning about their daughter's character and decision-making abilities. The attention was particularly difficult for her mother, who worried about the potential consequences Sarah faced. Military legal proceedings moved forward with methodical precision, while public attention continued to intensify. Sarah was assigned military defense counsel, who warned her that the charges she faced could result in dismissal from service, forfeiture of benefits, and possible imprisonment. The gravity of her legal situation stood in stark contrast to the heroic narrative that was developing in public discourse about her actions. The psychological pressure of facing court-martial proceedings, while being portrayed as both a hero and a rogue, military officer created enormous stress for Sarah. She had joined the military, with dreams of serving her country and proving that women could excel in combat roles. Instead, she found herself at the center of controversies about military authority, gender equality, and the proper use of armed force in civilian situations. Colonel Harrison's investigation into the incident revealed additional details that complicated Sarah's legal situation. Radio recordings showed that she had received clear orders to disengage from the crisis and return to base, orders that she had acknowledged but deliberately ignored. The evidence of willful disobedience strengthened the case for serious disciplinary action under military law. As Sarah awaited the formal beginning of court-martial proceedings, she realized that her fate would depend not only on military law, but also on political considerations and public opinion that extended far beyond the confines of Fort Campbell. The woman who had been underestimated throughout her career now found herself at the center of national debates about some of the most fundamental questions in American civil-military relations. The court-martial proceedings began 3 months after the hijacking incident, during which time Sarah had become a household name across America. Public opinion polls showed that 67% of Americans supported her actions, while military personnel remained deeply divided about whether she should face punishment for saving innocent lives. The courtroom at Fort Campbell was packed with media representatives, legal observers, and supporters who had traveled from across the country to witness the proceedings. Major General Robert Chen, the presiding officer for the court-martial, had served in combat zones for over 20 years and understood the complexities of split-second decision-making under extreme pressure. However, he also recognized that military discipline and chain of command were fundamental principles that could not be compromised without undermining the entire structure of military organization. The case before him represented a direct conflict between these competing values. The prosecution's case was methodical and legally sound, focusing on Sarah's clear violation of direct orders and unauthorized use of military weapons in a domestic situation. The lead prosecutor, Lieutenant Colonel James Murphy, argued that allowing Sarah to escape serious consequences would encourage other service members to ignore orders whenever they disagreed with their superiors. He emphasized that military effectiveness depended on instant obedience to lawful orders, not individual judgment about their appropriateness. Lieutenant Colonel Murphy presented radio recordings that clearly showed Sarah receiving orders to disengage from the hijacking situation and return to base immediately. Her acknowledgement of these orders, followed by deliberate disobedience, constituted willful insubordination under military law. The prosecutor argued that Sarah's motivations and the successful outcome of her actions were irrelevant to the legal question of whether she had violated her oath of military service. The defense strategy developed by civilian attorney Margaret Foster, who had volunteered to represent Sarah without charge, focused on the doctrine of necessity and the obligation of military personnel to protect innocent lives when civilian authorities were unable to do so. Foster argued that Sarah's actions were justified by the immediate threat to 147 passengers and the absence of any other effective response option within the critical time frame. Margaret Foster had built her legal career defending military personnel, accused of various offenses, and she understood that Sarah's case presented unique challenges and opportunities. The unprecedented nature of the situation meant that there was little legal precedent to guide the court's decision-making process. Foster's strategy was to establish that extraordinary circumstances required extraordinary responses that might violate normal protocols while serving higher moral and legal obligations. The prosecution called Colonel Harrison as their primary witness to establish the command structure and the specific orders that Sarah had violated. Harrison's testimony was precise and damaging, detailing Sarah's history of challenging authority and her pattern of requesting assignments beyond her authorized capabilities. He portrayed her intervention as the culmination of a career-long tendency toward insubordination and disregard for military hierarchy. Under cross-examination, Margaret Foster revealed that Colonel Harrison had consistently opposed women serving in combat roles and had used his authority to limit Sarah's opportunities for advancement. She presented evidence that Harrison had denied Sarah's request for Apache training multiple times, despite her superior performance in other aircraft. The testimony suggested that Harrison's opposition to Sarah was based on gender bias rather than legitimate concerns about her capabilities. The FBI agent who had given Sarah unofficial permission to intervene provided crucial testimony that complicated the prosecution's narrative. Agent David Rodriguez explained that conventional law enforcement response options had been exhausted and that Sarah's offer represented the only viable option for preventing mass casualties. His testimony revealed that he had assumed responsibility for authorizing her intervention based on the immediate threat to innocent lives. Agent Rodriguez's testimony created significant problems for the prosecution's case by suggesting that Sarah had received authorization from the senior law enforcement official at the scene. While this authorization was not proper under military protocol, it demonstrated that Sarah had not acted entirely on her own initiative. The testimony raised complex questions about interagency cooperation during emergency situations and the authority of civilian law enforcement to direct military actions. The most powerful testimony came from passengers who had been aboard the hijacked aircraft during the crisis. Emily Chen, a 34-year-old teacher who had been traveling with her 8-year-old daughter, described the terror inside the aircraft as hijackers threatened passengers with explosive devices. Her emotional testimony about watching the hijacker hold her daughter in the doorway while threatening to detonate his vest brought many courtroom observers to tears. Additional passenger testimony revealed that the hijackers had become increasingly violent and unstable as their deadline approached. Flight attendant Patricia Williams testified that she had heard one hijacker tell another that they should finish this rather than continue negotiations with authorities. The testimony suggested that Sarah's intervention had prevented an imminent massacre rather than simply ending a negotiation standoff. The technical aspects of Sarah's marksmanship during the intervention provided another crucial element of the defense case. Ballistics experts testified that the shot Sarah had fired required extraordinary skill and precision under extremely challenging conditions. The expert testimony established that Sarah's intervention had been executed with a level of technical competence that minimized risks to innocent passengers while effectively neutralizing the primary threat. Defense witnesses included several of Sarah's former flight instructors who testified about her exceptional skills and judgment under pressure. These witnesses established that Sarah had consistently demonstrated the kind of tactical thinking and split-second decision-making that the military valued in combat situations. Their testimony painted a picture of an officer who had acted according to her training and experience rather than recklessly endangering lives. The prosecution's rebuttal focused on the fundamental principle that military personnel must follow orders regardless of their personal assessment of situations. Lieutenant Colonel Murphy argued that allowing exceptions to military discipline, even for apparently justified reasons, would create dangerous precedents that could undermine military effectiveness. He emphasized that civilian authorities existed to handle domestic law enforcement situations, and that military intervention was prohibited for important constitutional reasons. Expert testimony about military law and the constitutional separation of civilian and military authority provided additional support for the prosecution's position. Professor of Law Jonathan Martinez from West Point explained that the founders of the American Republic had deliberately created barriers to military involvement in domestic situations to prevent the development of military dictatorship. Sarah's actions, however well-intentioned, had violated these fundamental principles. International law experts testified about the global implications of military intervention in civilian law enforcement situations. Their testimony revealed that Sarah's actions could set precedents that might be cited by authoritarian governments to justify military involvement in domestic politics. The testimony suggested that the case had implications extending far beyond Sarah's individual situation. The defense's closing argument emphasized the moral imperative to save innocent lives when conventional authorities were unable to act effectively. Margaret Foster argued that military oaths included obligations to protect innocent people, that sometimes required service members to act beyond the strict letter of their orders. She pointed out that military personnel were regularly expected to use initiative and judgment in combat situations where strict adherence to orders might result in disaster. The prosecution's closing argument focused relentlessly on the importance of military discipline and civilian control over armed forces. Lieutenant Colonel Murphy argued that the military could not function effectively if individual service members were allowed to make independent decisions about when to follow orders and when to substitute their own judgment. He insisted that Sarah's case, regardless of its outcome, threatened the fundamental structure of military organization. As the court-martial board retired to deliberate Sarah's fate, the entire military and much of the American public waited to learn whether her actions would be vindicated or condemned. The decision would establish precedents that could influence military law and civilian-military relations for generations to come, while Sarah faced the possibility of losing everything she had worked to achieve throughout her military career. The court-martial board deliberated for 18 hours before reaching their verdict, a time frame that reflected the complexity and unprecedented nature of Sarah's case. When the board members returned to the courtroom, their expressions revealed nothing about their decision. Maintaining the stoic professionalism expected of military officers facing one of the most difficult judgments in recent military history, the packed courtroom fell silent as Major General Chen prepared to announce the verdict that would determine Sarah's fate and establish precedents. For military law, the board found Sarah guilty of willful disobedience of a direct order, acknowledging that she had clearly violated explicit instructions from Colonel Harrison to disengage from the hijacking situation and return to base. However, they also found her not guilty of the more serious charges related to unauthorized use of military weapons and conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline. The mixed verdict reflected the board's recognition that Sarah's actions had violated military protocol while serving a higher moral purpose. The sentencing portion of the proceedings revealed the board's struggle to balance military discipline with recognition of Sarah's extraordinary service and life-saving actions. Rather than dismissal from service or imprisonment, the board sentenced Sarah to a formal reprimand, reduction in rank by 1 grade, and forfeiture of 2 months' pay. The relatively lenient sentence acknowledged her violations while recognizing the exceptional circumstances that had prompted her actions. Major General Chen's explanation of the verdict provided insight into the board's reasoning and the precedent they hoped to establish for future cases. He emphasized that military discipline remained paramount and that service members could not simply ignore orders based on their personal assessment of situations. However, he also acknowledged that Sarah's actions had been motivated by a genuine desire to save innocent lives and had been executed with extraordinary skill and precision. The general's statement included specific recognition of the exceptional circumstances that had made conventional response options impossible within the available time frame. He noted that the hijackers' possession of explosive devices and their demonstrated willingness to harm passengers had created a situation where immediate action was necessary to prevent mass casualties. The statement suggested that similar circumstances might justify similar actions in future emergencies. Colonel Harrison's reaction to the verdict was one of barely controlled fury, though he maintained military bearing throughout the proceedings. His post-trial statements to military media emphasized his belief that the lenient sentence would encourage future acts of insubordination and undermine military discipline. Harrison argued that the board had been swayed by public opinion and media pressure rather than focusing solely on military law and precedent. The public reaction to Sarah's conviction and sentencing was overwhelmingly supportive, with opinion polls showing that 82% of Americans believed the punishment was appropriate or too harsh. Veterans organizations issued statements praising Sarah's courage while acknowledging the importance of military discipline. Several congressional representatives called for changes to military law that would provide clearer guidance for similar situations in the future. Sarah's response to the verdict demonstrated the maturity and professionalism that had characterized her throughout the proceedings. She accepted responsibility for violating orders while maintaining that her actions had been necessary to save innocent lives. Her statement emphasized her continued commitment to military service and her hope that her case would lead to better procedures for handling emergency situations that required rapid response. The passengers whose lives Sarah had saved organized a public ceremony to honor her actions and raise funds for her legal expenses. Emily Chen, the teacher whose daughter had been held by the hijacker, spoke eloquently about Sarah's courage and the debt of gratitude that all passengers owed to her. The ceremony attracted national media attention and reinforced public support for Sarah's actions. The military's response to the case included immediate reviews of existing protocols for emergency situations and Interagency cooperation during domestic crises. Senior Pentagon officials acknowledged that current procedures were inadequate for handling rapidly developing situations where military assets might be the only effective response option. These reviews led to new policies that provided clearer guidance for military personnel facing similar dilemmas. Sarah's career continued, despite her conviction, though her opportunities for advancement were limited by the formal reprimand in her service record. She was reassigned to a different unit where she continued flying Apache helicopters in training exercises and routine operations. Her commanding officers noted that she remained an exceptional pilot whose skills and judgment were valued. Despite her previous disciplinary issues, that case attracted international attention from military organizations and legal scholars studying the balance between military discipline and moral imperatives. Several allied nations modified their own emergency response procedures based on lessons learned from Sarah's case. The incident became a case study taught in military academies around the world as an example of the complex ethical and legal issues facing modern military personnel. Margaret Foster's successful defense of Sarah led to numerous speaking engagements and consulting opportunities with military legal organizations. Her innovative arguments about necessity doctrine and moral obligations became influential in military law scholarship. Foster continued representing military personnel in challenging cases, often citing Sarah's case as precedent for considering exceptional circumstances in disciplinary proceedings. The long-term impact of Sarah's actions extended far beyond her individual case to influence broader discussions about women in combat roles and military capabilities. Her demonstration of exceptional skill under extreme pressure helped counter arguments that women lacked the physical and emotional capabilities for combat operations. The case became a landmark in the ongoing evolution of military gender policies. 5 years after the hijacking incident, Sarah was promoted to major despite the formal reprimand in her record. Her promotion came with assignment to a special operations unit, where her skills and experience were considered particularly valuable. The promotion demonstrated that the military had ultimately recognized her contributions while maintaining the principle that violations of orders carried consequences. The hijacking incident and Sarah's intervention became the subject of books, documentaries, and congressional hearings that examined military roles in domestic emergency response. The case influenced legislation, providing clearer authority for military commanders to respond to terrorist attacks and other domestic emergencies. Sarah's actions had inadvertently triggered policy changes that made similar interventions more legally defensible in the future. 10 years later, Colonel Sarah Martinez commanded her own Apache squadron and was recognized as one of the military's most experienced combat pilots. Her unit had served with distinction in overseas operations where her leadership and tactical expertise had saved numerous lives and completed critical missions. The woman who had once been underestimated by her colleagues had proven that gender was irrelevant to military effectiveness and leadership capability. The legacy of Sarah's actions continued to influence military culture and policy long after her individual case had been resolved. Her story became an inspiration for women entering military service and a reminder that doing the right thing sometimes required courage to challenge established authority. The Apache helicopter that she had flown during the rescue operation was eventually retired to a military museum, where it stands as a monument to the principle that saving innocent lives justifies extraordinary risks and exceptional courage. Sarah's transformation from an underestimated female pilot to a decorated military leader demonstrated that true leadership emerges not from following orders blindly, but from having the wisdom to know when circumstances require actions that transcend normal protocols. Her story proved that those who are underestimated often possess the very qualities that make them capable of achieving extraordinary things when given the opportunity to demonstrate their true capabilities.